we start? Because it's time. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Michal Boni. We are participating in the Igrzyska Wolności event organized as every year, but this year online. And today in this panel, we will discuss about digital sovereignty. We have the wonderful, excellent guests, Laurelien Hoet from Microsoft, Marietje Schaake, former member of the European Parliament, now working in Stanford as the director responsible for many cyber issues. We have Małgorzata Bonikowska from Polish THINKTANK, very experienced and very useful in many important public discussions. We have Marta Poślad from Google Poland, very involved in many digital and social activities. And last but not least, we have Krzysztof Kwiatkowski, now senator and very active in the public area through many years. Thank you to all of you for your decision to participate in this meeting. As you know, as we all know, strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty is a very hot topic discussed, especially also taking into account geostrategic dimension of this issue, especially I think that after Mike Pompeo announcement at the beginning of August on clean internet, there were many debates, discussions, and I think a new view on this topic, strategic autonomy. What does it really mean? But not only geostrategic, geopolitical dimension is crucial for strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty, also the acceleration of digital transformation visible all over the world during pandemic, and increasing of cybersecurity incidents. So I think it's also very important. Our task today is to discuss about what does it really mean digital sovereignty, and also what kind of solutions are needed to respond to sovereignty at risk phenomenon. And we need to consider what kind of ways could be necessary, legislative, new regulatory framework, or technological new solutions developed and offered by companies, and also what kind of institutional support for making the digital world much more responsible is needed. When I'm talking about institutional aspect, I'm thinking about capabilities and capacities for risk management, and also I'm talking about possible partnerships between all like-minded partners when we are discussing how to respond to those incidents, cybersecurity incidents, all to make in our countries, in our continents, in our regions, digital much more secure and sovereign, if you can say. We want to start with a general view on this issue. So let's start with a fundamental question. What does it really mean, digital sovereignty? How do you understand this phenomenon? And we will start with Marta Poślad. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your question. And first of all, thank you for having me for this discussion. I may not be able to satisfy the question fully, because I have to say that digital sovereignty is a very blurry concept. I think it means different things for different people, for different groups, for different stakeholders around the topic. But one thing I can tell is that definitely doesn't resonate with me and where I stand. I think there is a lot of negativity attached to digital sovereignty as such at the time when I think 2020 is really teaching us about solidarity. We've been wearing masks. We've been swapping intelligence around the pandemic. And I think the lesson learned for 2020 is that definitely working together and building together is much more helpful and useful than seeking ways to decouple or go towards different ways. But I do have an alternative to offer, and that has been circulated by a number of experts who talk about the term strategic interdependence. And I think that this is the term that I would see for this framework as working much better. And I truly believe that this debate doesn't exist in isolation. This is not only an academic discussion. I think this is one of a very hot topics that every month are shed in a new light. And I think the new context is obviously the change in the United States. No matter what that change is, we will certainly see a redefinition of the transatlantic relationship. And I truly believe that the concept, be it digital sovereignty, be it strategic autonomy, be it strategic interdependence, will be defined by months to come. And I would love for that concept to truly believe cooperation. I would love for that to cherish shared values between Europe and the United States, but also really defining what bothers stakeholders, various stakeholders, including, of course, citizens at both sides of the Atlantic. I think there is a broad agreement that things need to be discussed, and nobody is shying away from it. But I would be urging not to just stop and now try to define digital sovereignty, but really look at what's at the heart of the problem. Thank you.
Michael, you unmute yourself, please.
Its host make it. Thank you very much, Marta. I think it's important to add to our discussion the expression strategic interdependence, because I think it's much more addressed to the real challenges and real issues. And also we need to raise the problem of transatlantic cooperation, especially after the results, from my point of view, positive results of the US presidential election. Now I want to ask Krzysztof Kwiatkowski about your view on the problem of digital sovereignty from the perspective of Poland, from the perspective of your experience. Please, Krzysztof.
Dziękuję za to pytanie o Polski.
Thank you very much for this question related to the Polish context. I agree with the fourth speaker who said that we need to follow the same path in digital solutions. It is worth noting that there'll be two planes. The plane where there is a self-imposing way which gives you a synergistic effect when developing infrastructure. It would be hard to imagine that if we are to speak about efficient model, not to take up decisions throughout Europe when it comes to specific technologies. I'm speaking in the context of 5G technologies, and there are autonomous areas. Beyond any doubts, specific countries will want to keep up the decision scope within their limits. Let me refer to specific Polish examples. For me, where every state will be willing to retain their autonomy in the context of ICT systems in use, and only national factor will impact the choice, use, and maintenance of systems will pertain to electoral systems of ICT nature. We have seen the situations in the US today. Even diversification of the systems at the level of particular states leads to problematic situations. Therefore, beyond any doubts, I can say that the ICT systems that serve the most important element of the democracy, that is, vote counting, should be the domain of national states. Ex-president of the Supreme Chamber of Auditing, this should pertain to control of the Polish electoral systems used. So we have demonstrated lack of professionalism and readiness and action plan that results great organizational turbulences. This is a key element. Organizational turbulences may undermine the citizens' trust towards democratic institutions. If a citizen waits a few days, or God forbid, over a week, as it is the case of the USA, there is a broader and broader plane for populists who may pose questions whether counting is proper. Let me refer to some other example where we have broad-scope cooperation in need. The national states not always are able to do that. We have a very interesting example, viaTOLL system for using national roads. Income from the system supplies the National Road Fund. After elections, Law and Justice said in 2015, no, this system will not be managed by a private company, Kapsch from Austria. It's too important an element for the state functioning. It produces 2 billion of Polish zlotys of budgetary income. There'll be the state responsible for that. What has PIS did? They announced we are opening the new tender for the administration of the system. It was supposed to be the Ministry of Infrastructure. I'm speaking about details because the Supreme Chamber of Auditing delved into the problems in details in my terms of office. The ministry delivers this political will many months after they have to cancel the tender because it was so poorly prepared that in the first phase, the subcontractors and prospective contractors filed in their motions. There was such a short time that the ministry had to make a decision. We need to choose freely. The executive bodies had to prepare an act accepted by lawmakers, which makes it the responsibility of the public body, the General Directorate of Motorways and Highways, who are unable to do that. 2 days prior to the deadline, they find a partner, the ICT Institute, and what do we find out? This partner requests what the Kapsch company, because after 2 years period, the political bodies were put into the situation of shame. They had a robust system that should be processed by a public body. In practice, they were unable to do it. And quietly, they signed the contract with the private body that has already served the system. I'm showing this example in order for you to understand that there are areas that the state should exercise its administration, like votes counting systems. And where there are areas open for private companies, like different billing systems, more complex one, because whenever the state wishes to do it on its own, is put into the situation of shame because they show that they are unable to exercise this duty 2 years after they signed a contract with a private body. I don't want to say this is a bad ending. It would be bad if the state ceased to collect the toll. At the end of the day, it was the officer who said, we can cooperate with a private body here, which is win-win for both parties, and it's not going to shake our sovereignty.
Okay, it's okay. Thank you very much, Krzysztof, for the description of this case. Very specific, very Polish, but on the other hand, it's important to understand that there are some exceptions probably needed when we are talking about digital sovereignty. But the question to Mariette, the digital sovereignty is a very hot topic, and the new expression, it's organizing political debates in the European Union, in the United States, all over the world. And we can discuss about digital sovereignty, but also we need to consider this strategic interdependence. But on the other hand, we need to take into account the question, the issues related to the national solutions, autonomous national solutions in some areas. How to join those perspectives, thinking about security, because it's crucial. Mariette, please.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to join you, although meeting in real life is always better than having another Zoom connection. My thoughts are as follows. I don't think that the sovereignty notion in the digital world's context is new. In fact, I think that, for example, the Chinese, but also the Russian governments have actually embraced this term a long time ago in their efforts to align, if you will, their territorial governance area and jurisdiction completely into the digital world. And what is new now is that this term has gained steam in the EU, for example, but also in other places. And because of the sensitivity around the word sovereignty, if you look at how it's been used by authoritarian regimes initially, but also if you look at the contrast between the interdependence and the mutual dependence, the connectivity that we find online vis-a-vis the notion of sovereignty, I think it may be useful, or I can observe that it's useful as a political rallying cry for Europeans to be more aware of the need to defend their own values and their own interests. But I would much rather think about strategic autonomy in the sense that the EU might have full agency, or any country may seek full agency to advance their own needs and hopefully values first. Of course, a lot has changed since the promise of the open internet has met the high stakes of geopolitics. And it is important that the EU is not naive here. Of course, there's a lot at stake, and it is important to provide human rights protecting, secure, public interest preserving, and sort of, enabling environment in which both trade and security and people's rights can be safeguarded. And for that, obviously, more is needed than what is done today. In the EU, I think specifically, there is a challenge between on the one hand, the promise of a single market, and Michal and I have worked a lot on the digital single market in Europe, and it's a work in progress. The idea that there's still so many barriers between different EU member states, even though the foundational dream and aspiration of the EU is to actually have a single space, right? For companies and citizens to know what to expect within that entire European Union, also in the digital world. But the promise of the single market, single space online, runs into a tension with national security concerns that are still decided on the national level, meaning 27 different times potentially, or different ways potentially in the EU that we know today. And clearly that tension is unsustainable. It is not possible to promise either to companies or to citizens that there is a level playing field, another foundational promise of the European Union in the digital space, while having national security concerns being carefully weighed, but in each national interest. And so I would say that in order to achieve strategic autonomy, it is important that the European member states specifically make a big decision about how to best defend their values and interests. And in my opinion, fragmentation, which unfortunately is still the product of a lot of member state capitals' decisions to hold decision-making power very closely to them, not to work together on an EU-wide scale. I think it is actually hindering that strategic autonomy, and it's also hindering another big promise beyond that of the single market, which is that of a more geopolitical European Union. And I think nowhere more clearly than in the digital realm do we see that actually security, economy, and rights are so integrated that it's really hard to say, oh, well, we have a promise of a single market, we do have fundamental rights in the European Union, but we cannot agree on where national security interests lie. And so I think the biggest step between a political rallying cry around strategic autonomy and an actual reality of strategic autonomy must come from member states choosing to overcome their fragmentation, to work as a geopolitical actor, and to understand better what high stakes are being fought out. This is not a theoretical discussion. Which high stakes are being fought out over which model gets to prevail? Is it a privatized governance model? Is it an authoritarian governance model? Or is it a democratic governance model? And I hope I'm not surprising anyone when I say that I think there's an urgent need for a democratic governance model and for strong leadership from the EU to get us there.
Thank you very much, Mariette. I think that it is important to understand that when we are talking about you prefer strategic autonomy, I agree with you. We need to remember that there is a discussion when we are talking in the European Union about European strategic autonomy. Not coming back, we are not coming back to the national level. This is additional problem, yes, but I think that we need to overcome this fragmentation. It's crucial, and on the other hand, we need to remember that strategic autonomy shouldn't mean strategic autarky, because it would be very dangerous, yes, for the digital development all over the world. So thanks a lot. And now Małgorzata Bonikowska, the turn is yours. So what is your view on those issues, please?
Thank you, Michael. Well, first of all, I am a political scientist. I specialize in European studies, so I just follow the EU developments all the time. And I would like just to clarify certain notions from the political point of view. First of all, sovereignty. Sovereignty is something we attribute normally to the states or to supranational organizations like the European Union, which is still not a state, but we are almost there. But we are definitely something more than an international organization. However, the hybrid structure of the European Union makes all these processes much more complicated. So sovereignty, it in practice means that we as states, we also as the European Union would be able to react independently and maneuver by legal solutions, by political decisions in order to protect whatever we want to protect. It could be our internal situation, or it could be also our external foreign interests, right? That's sovereignty. Now, strategic autonomy is a concept which is not very old, and actually it was born because European Union and just Europe as a continent suddenly started to feel just in a trap between two very powerful powers. China, which started to raise and maneuver and push us and also treat us as a battlefield for their technologies, businesses, business proposals, and everything else. And the United States, which Europe always considered an ally and a very strong, let's call it brother. But under the Donald Trump presidency, it started to feel a lot of difficulties. We Europeans started to feel uncomfortable because in many situations, European Union and the US had different opinions. And it was not only opinions, there were actions like, Donald Trump's withdrawal from Paris Agreement, like withdrawing from Iran deal, and many others. So European Union leaders started to feel that, okay, in this situation, we are just in the middle of these two. These two are not going to somehow agree on anything. We will face a decade or just a century of rivalry. So where is the place of Europe? And in this situation, European Union decided, well, it's high time to take our things in our hands and build capacities to play independently, to play as a sovereign power. It does not mean we want to be against anybody. It does not mean that we don't want interdependence. Interdependence, it's obvious process of globalization. We are very much interdependent on each other. Especially we want to keep interdependence with the United States. But the question would be how far Europe or European Union specifically can go in a sovereign direction, being something different than the United States and then China, being just an independent player. And I think digital sovereignty fits into these kind of discussions within the European Union, because we've just discovered it's not only about the economy, it's not only about political decisions, it's not only about power in security terms, classical security terms, and obviously we all know that European Union doesn't have really structures to provide ourselves the security aspect. We count still on NATO. But in the digital sphere, that's something new we should react on. And it's not only about the digital market, digital market. It's also about security, cyber security, information war, protection, as somebody previously said, protection of our election systems, and also about the whole capacity of the Europeans to be sovereign. Even this meeting, we have very prestigious, very interesting people, two ladies from two American companies. Where are the European companies? That's what we feel like a little bit inconvenience, that we see in Europe that we are the third in the line. We lost maybe our leading position, and we should do something to build again our capacities for innovations, for creating startups, for creating, dynamic economic boost also in this new 21st century. And just to conclude, I think this discussion fits very much into the much larger discussion in the European Union about how to reform the European Union as a structure in order to fit much better in the 21st century needs, which mean for us a lot of inconvenience. There are bad times for European Union. When we have to consider it, we have to somehow find a response to a much worse political climate around us. And I don't think it means doing anything against any of our allies, but it means to build up our own internal capacity to help to be an important player together with our allies.
Thank you, Małgorzata. I think it is very inspiring. And also, of course, we need to remember about our European values, European promises, and European capacity, especially for the future and for the future development. But on the other hand, when we are discussing about building European capacity, I think that we need to be a little cautious, not to limit cooperation. For example, when we are discussing about flow of data in medical areas and so on and so on. So some important messages done by European commissioners that we need to have all our data in the European Union is something which is a little dangerous for the patients, for the users. We can discuss, of course, about it, yes, but I think that it's too easy for a European to say that, okay, we need to find our own way, and why we have during this discussion, for example, representatives of Google or Microsoft, not European companies, but I can say that those companies are the best in some areas. Yes? So it doesn't mean that there are not European companies, but I think that we need to also to look from the global perspective at the digital area, because digital is especially global. Now the last question and the last point in this first round to Laurelien, what is your opinion from the perspective of Microsoft, from the perspective of company, digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy? Microsoft is involved in many European activities and supportive for European development and European industries development. So how you can find themselves in this discussion on strategic autonomy?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. And I agree with very much what has been said before. I think the most common definition about digital sovereignty, European digital sovereignty, then of course, is Europe's ability to act independently in the digital world. And indeed, it's quite different from the legal sovereignty concept as you have been describing. I have tried, and obviously I agree also with Marta that depending on the stakeholder with whom you will speak, you will get another definition of digital sovereignty. But still, I have tried to make a distinction between two sets of concerns that lie behind Europe's concerns about digital sovereignty. The first one, I believe, is, and both are valid concerns, I think. The first one is, I believe about the wish to protect data of European citizens, natural persons, but also legal persons. So it can be personal data, it can be industrial data, and also the wish to protect critical infrastructure, but primarily against cyber threats. So that I would call protection of data and critical infrastructure, I mean, just for the ease of reference. The other one is a bit different, and you referred already to that. I think it's more an economic concern. This idea that Europe feels it's lagging behind China and US as tech superpowers and wants to catch up, whether it's on AI or microprocessors or cloud computing. There is this wish to make sure that the European digital economy grows. That's also a very valid concern. But they are very different, I think, both of them. And we need to continue making that distinction. And of course, it has already been mentioned, the COVID crisis has amplified these questions with the acceleration of digital, and also with the realization that of the importance of critical infrastructure in Europe. So the funny thing is that Europe is very sovereign when it is about regulation, I think, because we know, and it's called the Brussels effect, that Europe is very often recognized as almost a super regulator, and with its policy about privacy, consumer protection, competition law, it highly influences regulation all over the world, and impacts also the behavior of big corporations like us, sometimes to the irritation of other nation states even. But that's an area where Europe is very strong. And when thinking about digital sovereignty, obviously the first thing that comes into mind is also how to address this. Then, as Europe has this strong role in regulation, you would automatically then think about new forms of regulation. And I would like to add two reflections in that respect. So first of all, when it's about the protection of data and the protection of critical infrastructure, there I think regulation is obviously probably a logical answer. There is already a lot of regulation there, GDPR, NIS, Cybersecurity Act, and so on. For questions of like the economic digital sovereignty, which is sometimes also referred to as strategic autonomy, I believe. It's a bit different. Okay, in some areas, regulation may be necessary, but it's really about stimulating growth. And you cannot only do that with regulation. I would like to quote Carl Bildt, former Swedish Prime Minister, who said, you can't simply regulate unicorns into existing. And that's also a very important aspect to keep in mind. I think we will later on go into regulation, so I will not dwell onto that. I would just make one reflection, and that it's about, in recent regulatory discussions and policy discussions, we sometimes see a tendency towards more protectionist approaches than what we have been used to in this digital sovereignty debate. I think, for example, of the discussions around data localization. And of course, I mean, it's important to follow the interest of customers. And we, as Microsoft, we have 19 cloud regions in Europe, try to stay close to our customers. That's obviously important. We have also invested in Poland recently in that regard with the data center. But still, another thing would be to impose strict data localization requirements into law. And I think I just would like to add a reflection of to urge towards caution in this respect, because we need to carefully think about what that would imply for international data transfers, also for European companies that benefit from solutions and technology all over the world, and that also are more and more international companies themselves growing digitally and so on. So with that, I think I would like to, to close this first part.
Thank you very much, Laurelie, and I fully agree. And just one example, we have very famous European companies as Siemens and Philips, for example. They are active at the medical area for e-health, and they are in cooperation with many data centers and many partners from United States and from many continents. Because it is important when they are considering how to prepare and how to use the data to prepare better and deeper analysis of for example, of schemes for the development of some diseases, comparing the CT of lungs and so on and so on. And it is very important to have the bigger collection of data, especially under the pandemic as COVID is, than also European. So I agree with the idea, with the concept of digital sovereignty, but I think that we need to avoid the trap in which we will say, okay, autonomy as a first, and we will make and we will change the autonomy and make it as autarky, yes? And it will be against development, against innovation, against common goods and common solutions all over the globe. So we need to remember about it. The second round, we have 22 minutes for our discussion. I think that we need to focus on some issues as Laurelie has started to present some views on legislative framework, regulatory framework. Marta, could you say what is your opinion about the question, the problem, digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and legal aspects, and also how do you see the capacities and capabilities necessary for all companies to take risk assessment and risk management? Marta?
Yes, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. So again, I think it's a multilateral discussion, and we're talking about different ways of regulating or putting the concept of digital sovereignty or strategic autonomy or strategic interdependence into any kind of law or public policy. And referring to what I said in the first round, I think the overarching agreement here, the umbrella over whatever is going to happen next is diplomacy, is the new way in which the US-Europe relationship will be defined, or generally what will be the new redefinition in the whole global framework of various global powers, and I believe that this will define the way the further regulations will be cascading, then at the EU-specific level, then at the country level, then how companies will be deciding to work B2B between each other. And that's why I think we're very early in this discussion. And I really value the fact that today at this conference and at many other conferences, we are taking upon these discussions. And I feel I would love to call out what Marietje mentioned, and that being digital single market. And I feel that this is something we don't talk about enough. I think before we talk about the new concepts, there would be a lot of value in looking at digital single market completion and what else should be achieved before we start defining the external interdependencies. And I kind of feel the DSM discussion is sometimes out of fashion, but I think it should be definitely back high up on the agenda. And when it also comes to the assessment, I'd like to comment on what Małgorzata said before, and to address the question, where are the European companies? And here's the thing: we hear a lot of Europeans talking about the presence and the impact of American companies instead of taking the time to recognize what is already happening in Europe. There is a very long line and a big pool of successful European tech companies, be it starting from biggies like OVH, Atos, SAP, Spotify, Booking.com, Seznam, that is our Czech neighbor here out of Poland. And they're sometimes better at different things than US platforms, for example, would be, but they're also very often taking advantage of the infrastructure that US companies would be providing, or other way around. It's a great example, by the way, of interdependence, and something, again, not to shy away from, but something to really pay attention to as the ecosystem is there. Another part of the assessment should be what is currently needed. As we're all in the digital bubble here, we've been likely all following the debate about the percentage of the European budget that now should be going towards the digital agenda. And that would be telling about the real commitment of the Union to further pursue digitalization proactively and not through putting possible barriers for digitization. Last but not least, I think that today's discussions really requires looking at what happened in the past, from this point, 7 months already. The usage of the internet leaped about 5 years forward. We see a double interest of, for example, shopping online. Only in Central and Eastern Europe, we have 12 million new internet users. And one thing is clear: citizens, when they go online, they look for more and not less. And no matter how the pandemic will develop, part of our new rituals and part of our new needs will stay around. And I think that also needs to be at one end of the scale. Are we prepared to respond to that need and to ensure that this delivery is done in the most secure and user-friendly way? And that comes to the mix of a discussion, which I said cannot only remain an academic discussion. That's why it's great that we have practitioners here. It's great that we've got policymakers with us. It's great that we've got experts. But I think all these perspectives really need to come together, because we're still in the pandemic. We want to get out of this pandemic being next pandemic proof. So I think all those values should be weighted before any binding decisions are made.
Thank you, Marta. And I want to ask Małgorzata Bonikowska about your view, how important the digital sovereignty, keeping European values, European development, supportive for European development, is needed and necessary during the time of digital acceleration, which was mentioned by Marta. Yes, please, Małgorzata.
Well, I have to admit that European Union has done a lot of work, and lessons were taken from the last few years. And one of the lessons is that certain sectors are just much more strategic than we even thought. Healthcare could be one of the examples. We just didn't realize how strategic the healthcare system is for European countries. We cannot just have a situation in which in 95% we have to buy, supply products out of the EU, because in case of such stories like pandemic, we just feel completely, dependent on the other powers. Basically, we discovered this dependence from China and India and other producers from outside. I think digital, of course, it was discovered much earlier, but we are very much aware that the 21st century is a digital century. And the pandemic just even shown us the future, in a sense that, there are so many processes which went online completely, that the role of cybersecurity, but also role of functioning online in the internet, started to be the key reality. So definitely talking about digital Europe, it's talking about our future. And it's very much a strategic sector for us, like we much earlier discovered energy is a very strategic sector, right? So that's one point. Second point is to Lorelei, I very much agree with you, and I really very much like your approach, because I believe it's exactly like you described. But there is also a weakness of the European Union in this, because we were accused, and we are accused of being too much into regulations. And I think that's our weakness vis-a-vis the economy and innovations. Because why we have a situation when we look at the top 10 world companies, none of them is European. There are 7 Americans, 3 Chinese. So why is it like this? Because it's a consequence of also a certain process, which in many other areas may help, but in the economy, and especially in innovative businesses, it really doesn't help us much. It's over-regulation. So we are very much aware of of the necessity of doing something about it. And it's also about financing, because, when you compare the US and the European Union, much more private money is engaged, private equity funds in financing startups, in creating this, innovative culture. In Europe, we have much more public money responsible for that, and that's not a good situation for us. So I think in this regard, we just think to deregulate, to in a way to create much more favorable conditions for our companies, startups, and innovative businesses to grow. Krzysztof mentioned Kapsch. I mean, we have, of course, a lot of European companies, also old industrial superpowers like Siemens, even Kapsch or Bosch. But the problem is how competitive they can be in 21st century. Because in the same time, our competitiveness policy in European Union is very tough. We don't allow these companies to merge. And the famous, example of Siemens and Alstom, you know about it. In the same time, we have, for example, in telecom sector, you have, 4 telecom operators in the US, and we have more than 100 in the European Union. So we are not competitive globally. So if we look at the globe vis-a-vis, not only United States, because United States still is our key ally, and it will remain definitely our key ally. I have no doubt about it. But we have to also admit that to be an attractive ally for the Americans, we have to be strong. And this is nothing else than the American presidents, not only Donald Trump, by the way, but also the others tell us, take yourself the responsibility for security. 2% in NATO, spend it. The same way goes in the digital. Take yourself responsibility in being, powerful in this sector. You wouldn't like to have Europe completely dependent on the structures and on the base created elsewhere. So I think it's very much thinking in line, and also to build up this interdependence connectors, However, with a very strong focus on building up the European digital economy, because I think we are really a little bit backward. We have to do something about it if we want to be an important player in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 10 minutes and 3 persons. So just try to be very, very strict and brief. Laurelien, if we are in Europe, and what is your understanding from the perspective of Microsoft, if we are over-regulated, totally over-regulated, or this is a balance, equilibrium or not, and how we can think about digital sovereignty and the new forms of regulation, and question mark from me, please.
So I agree, and thank you. We shouldn't fall into the trap of over-regulating. That's for sure. But on the other hand, regulation will also remain necessary, and it's also in our tradition, in our European tradition. So we won't, from one day to another, change it. I just have a few, and I will really try to be brief. I have a few recommendations for how I believe good regulation should be, how we should go about this. First of all, it's important to really keep the balance between, on the one hand, the need for protections of data and critical infrastructure, and on the other hand, allowing economic actors to play, to innovate, to work. GDPR is generally, it's not perfect, but it's generally recognized as a balance tool. We are clearly struggling with some other tools, like the e-privacy, to name one. But it's really important to keep that, to strike that right balance, also because otherwise Europe is going to delegitimize itself if it doesn't find the right balance, and it's going to be a hurdle for companies, European players as well. And secondly, I think we need to take care in Europe that we have so many different legal instruments, for example, in the cyber world. And I know that Marietje find that doesn't go sometimes far enough, but we have NIS, we have ESI, we have now a new instrument in financial, which is called DORA, we have the ECC, which you have mentioned. And so we need to make sure that we streamline all the material obligations sufficiently. And then obviously we have already mentioned the idea of harmonization. Whenever it's necessary for the digital market, we should really think about harmonizing. Of course, there can be national situations where it's interesting to protect national critical infrastructure, but harmonization remains really, really key. And then maybe I would like to call out for a last point, and that is, it's good that Europe is thinking about digital sovereignty and how to go about this, but we cannot deny the fact that international cooperation will remain necessary. And for example, Schrems II, Cloud Act, cybersecurity, they show that international agreements, international cooperation will remain really, really necessary. And so European institutions shouldn't be shy to step up and also take that role internationally. I believe that's really important that we continue doing that.
Thank you very much. And practically speaking, we need to remember about common standards, standardization, global standardization, and certifications. It's crucial. Krzysztof, what is your view as a regulator, member of Polish Senate? How we need to discuss at the national level about those issues which are important for Europe and for global development of digital area in the future?
Zanim powiem,
before I tell you about regulation, Michał, let me give 2 sentences for my 4 speakers. When we spoke about the need to cooperate, we have a great example from the last year. In the entire European Union, after we will have a contract for vaccine provided by an American company, but it was only possible so quick only because it cooperates with a German company, a company from the EU. That shows how in extreme cases, and the corona pandemic is an extreme case, we look for partners that are most reliable and the community of values in transatlantic dimension is still present, because we see that we are solving this problem together by cooperation between an American and a European company. But we have to bear that in mind, and I consciously say that I know we are being listened to by representatives of American companies. We in Europe sometimes have this feeling that cooperation is not symmetrical. In Poland, the biggest contract for many years regarding cooperation between Poland and the US was the contract on the purchase of F-16 jet fighters. It was combined with offset, but in which the US has declared to transfer certain technologies to Poland in return for this enormous contract. And as a person who used to control that, the American party did not comply with its own obligations. Why am I talking about it? If we are facing, and Europe is facing, this choice, who's going to be the geostrategic partner in modern technologies, the 5G technology, if we look at the system of common values and safety, these assets speak for the US. But if we only speak about competition, then Chinese company can have a better offer. If I've just mentioned COVID cooperation, I cannot forget that before that cooperation between these American corporation and the German pharma companies was effective, the US president spoke about buying out this German company as the best scenario. We Europeans will remember that. And now moving on to the question of our host about regulations. It's a bit that the European sensitivity in personal data protection is a bit different than the American one. It may be sometimes even painful. I remember 10 years ago, as the Minister of Justice, I opened access to London Mortgage Registry online. I had severe discussions with the Polish inspector for data protection so that certain data can be available on the internet, even though that was essentially demanded. It increased the legal turnover because London Mortgage Register online, the information who owns the land or a flat gave basic information. That the Polish regulator still had doubts if that was possible. That shows the European specifics. But we also have great examples. We can dream also in new technologies. I remember the great success of the EU, that the EU started and completed the process of unifying roaming tolls. Today, EU citizens pay the same price, no matter if they live in Portugal or in Latvia. They call from one to the other end of the EU. That only shows that if EU wants, it can solve all problems. Future cooperation in modern technologies, I see only one direction, that involvement in that area must be community solutions, because that shows how to overcome those national and regional competition items, and additionally it strengthens our voice when talking to our natural yet very demanding American partners. We want to make business with them, but on partners basis, and we know our friends from the US very well. And we know that to be a partner, you need to be strong enough to make mutually beneficial businesses.
Especially when you have mentioned this cooperation between Fisher and the European company. And also we need to remember that there were something like nearly 200 million euro sent by European Commission to this project, yes? So I think that when we will be able to create some common projects, practical projects. I think it will be very, very fruitful. Today, when we are discussing about implementation of 5G, also many American companies and also American authorities very often are mentioning Ericsson and Nokia, yes, European companies, not Huawei. Yes, so I think that we are participating in building these transatlantic strong relations and connections. And the final opinion, Mariette, from the global perspective, also, you know, European perspective, you know, American perspective. You have been very involved in privacy protection and security issues. What is your view how to join those perspectives? Development, innovation, global solutions, internet as a global solution, and on the other hand, digital sovereignty and digital and strategic autonomy. Please, some kind of wrap up of our discussion.
Thank you. I'll do my best. And I will also add maybe some points that are very different from what we've heard in this second round of questions, because I think the whole idea that we can look at regulation as something that we may wish or not wish to see is the completely wrong angle. And I understand that companies don't like regulation, but in fact, I don't think that that should be the leading perspective. The idea of regulating is often born out of the need to protect core principles. You just mentioned privacy, you just mentioned security, but we can add public safety, public health, the well-being of children, mental health, non-discrimination, access to information, the need for independent oversight. All of these should not sound extraordinary or strange. In fact, they are applied as principles, sometimes with regulation, sometimes with other mechanisms of oversight and accountability to so many sectors. And I think we are witnessing a moment where the role of technology has gotten so big that those very core principles are often challenged by the disruption that technology brings. And so I predict a catching up of legislative efforts, not only in Europe. I think we can already see nostalgia on the part of Silicon Valley-based companies for the time that Europe seemed to be their biggest problem. I mean, look at the polarized way in which the role of tech companies is now discussed on Capitol Hill. It is not putting principles first. It has now become very politicized, where, you know, one side or the other sees malign intent on the part of companies in their behavior. And I think it's crucial, for the sake of preserving democracy, that there is a principle-based view of what the role of technology is. And that will probably mean some more restrictions put in the way of the private sector. But if that means we can preserve the rule of law, I think that's a trade-off we can well make. At the same time, of course, in Europe, there has to be a lot of effort done to make sure that the great talents and the great companies and the great startups that we have can flourish. That Europeans can make their own decisions about the strategic nature of certain sectors. Think also about microchips, which I haven't heard much, but where Europe also has a strength. And in fact, when you look at the telecom sector, Europe has a lot of strong actors that are also active in the rest of the world. And I would say, interestingly enough, sometimes having strong companies like in the telecom sector actually hinder innovation, just because their incumbent power. And Michal and I have had, you know, lots of dealings with the telecoms operators, for example, around net neutrality, doesn't mean that it puts you in the best sort of innovation position. So in any case, I would say, let us look at what principles need to be preserved. Let us look at what maximum agency looks like for Europeans, not so much for the sake of competing in one global race or the other, but much more for the sake of preserving the rights and principles that have been hard fought. I think I don't have to remind any Polish person, you know, how difficult and fragile it is to preserve the core rule of law and democratic principles that exist. And they're increasingly at stake in the digital world. And therefore, I think it is important that we appreciate that and that we work on the basis of preserving those principles and not have a sort of principled, or not principled, but rather sort of prejudging idea about regulation in the sense that it's always bad or always good. That's just not my experience with it, having served for 10 years in a lawmaking role. Some of it works, some of it doesn't work. And it's always a question of, does it bring us further to enhancing the quality of life of people? And increasingly, we need to think about regulation as a mechanism to preserve democracy and the rule of law.
Thank you very much, Mariette. I think it was a very inspiring for the future also wrap up of our discussion. We need to remember that we have discussed about digital sovereignty and strategic autonomy, participating in freedom games. So I think freedom is the key value, and I think we need to raise it, and we need to keep it, we need to protect it. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to organizers, and have a nice afternoon, and probably try to meet in different kind of webinars during this online eruption of conferences and so on. Thank you very much. Bye.